Ethan Sterling, the kind of man whose name was synonymous with success and solitude, sat in his sprawling penthouse, its glass walls framing a city that never slept. At 42, he was a titan of industry, but his life felt as sterile as his minimalist apartment. A sudden, almost whimsical impulse led him to hire a personal chef, not for companionship, but for a way to make his extravagant home feel less like a gilded cage and more like, well, a home. He never expected that his search for flavor would lead him to Clara, a young chef with a quiet grace, whose simple dishes held a story of their own. And he certainly never expected that when he discovered she was pregnant and alone, he would find himself not firing her, but cooking for her, and in the process, falling for a love that was far richer than any fortune. Hello, bestie. Welcome. Please stay with me as I unfold this interesting romantic story. If you enjoy the story, please support us by subscribing to this channel and hit the notification button for more. Thank you. Grab your popcorn, sit back, relax, and enjoy this story. Ethan Sterling lived a life that was both the envy and the mystery of New York City. At 42, his name was a byword for success. Sterling Innovations, his brainchild, had reshaped the tech landscape, and his net worth was a number few could truly comprehend. Yet, for all the billions, the towering achievements, and the magazine covers, his existence was a masterpiece of solitude. His penthouse, a marvel of modern architecture, sat atop a skyscraper with a panoramic view of Central Park. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a silent, ever-changing portrait. The interior was a study in minimalism. Polished concrete floors, sleek black furniture, and a single, abstract sculpture in the living room. Everything was perfect, immaculate, and utterly devoid of warmth. Ethan moved through these sterile spaces like a ghost in his own home. His days were a rigid sequence of meetings, data analysis, and market strategies. He ate his meals, often a prepackaged, nutrient-rich shake, standing at his kitchen island, staring out at the vibrant city below, a city he commanded but never truly belonged to. He was the architect of a world that celebrated connection, yet he remained fundamentally disconnected. His life was a gilded cage, and he was both the prisoner and the keeper. The silence in his home was a physical presence, a constant reminder that for all his fortune, he was profoundly alone. Ethan Sterling's life was a predictable, meticulously orchestrated machine. Every day was a mirror image of the last, a cycle of meetings, market reports, and the cold, unyielding silence of his penthouse. The solitude, once a symbol of his control, had begun to feel like a heavy cloak, suffocating him slowly. One evening, as he stared at the bland, pre-packaged meal in his hand, the same meal he had eaten for the past 3 weeks, a strange, almost whimsical thought seized him. He didn't want to eat this sterile food anymore. He wanted something real. He wanted flavor. The impulse was so foreign to his nature that he almost dismissed it. But the thought took root. He wasn't looking for companionship, not truly. He was searching for a distraction, a way to add a flicker of life to his meticulously curated existence. He wanted to delegate the one part of his life he had completely neglected, the simple human act of eating. The solution was obvious, yet entirely new to him. He would hire a personal chef. He contacted a high-end agency, specifying his requirements with the same precision he applied to a business acquisition. He wanted someone discreet, professional, and, most importantly, a culinary artist. He wanted food that spoke, that told a story, that could fill the void left by the silence. He didn't know it then, but he wasn't just searching for a chef. He was searching for a person, for a connection, for a way to make his extravagant home feel less like a gilded cage and more like, well, a home. He was searching for a flavor that could finally break through his fortress of solitude. The penthouse, once a monument to stark minimalism, was about to receive its first brushstroke of life. The culinary agency had sent over a few portfolios, but one had stood out. It wasn't the 5-star reviews or the glowing references that caught Ethan's eye. It was the photography. The pictures weren't of the chef herself, but of her food. A rustic lemon tart with a golden brown lattice crust, a vibrant beet salad arranged like a painter's palette, a simple bowl of pasta that looked like a warm, comforting embrace. The chef's name was Clara. She arrived a week later, a quiet presence in the vast, echoing space. She was younger than he expected, maybe 26, with a gentle demeanor and a pair of observant, intelligent eyes. She wasn't intimidated by the sterile opulence of his kitchen, which was more of a showpiece than a place of creation. She simply walked in, her hands moving with a practiced grace as she unpacked her tools and arranged her spices. The first meal she prepared was a revelation. A seared salmon with a dill and caper sauce, served over a bed of roasted asparagus. It was simple, yet everything about it was extraordinary. The fish was perfectly cooked, the sauce was a delicate balance of tang and herb, and the asparagus was tender crisp. But it was more than just the taste. It was the way the dish was presented, a work of art on the plate, a story told in flavors. Ethan ate his meal at the kitchen island, not standing as usual but actually sitting down. He found himself slowing down, savoring each bite, trying to decipher the notes of flavor she had woven into the dish. Clara worked silently, cleaning up as he ate, a quiet storm of efficiency and talent. Her food was an art form, a window into a life lived with a different kind of richness than his own. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something other than silence fill his home. He felt a sense of anticipation. He was no longer just eating, he was experiencing. And he found himself looking forward to the next chapter of Clara's story. The week following Clara's arrival, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift began to take place in Ethan's life. The silence in his penthouse was no longer an empty void. It was punctuated by the gentle clatter of pans and the rhythmic chopping of vegetables. The air, once sterile and scentless, now carried the fragrant memory of roasted garlic or the sweet promise of caramelizing onions. Ethan, a man whose life was measured in stock market ticks and fiscal quarters, found himself looking forward to the end of the day for a different reason entirely. He would rush back from the office, the usual press of city life and business deals fading into the background, all because he was anticipating the new story Clara would tell him through her food. Her dishes were a revelation, a masterclass in comfort and artistry. One night, she prepared a classic coq au vin. The chicken was so tender it fell off the bone. The rich, wine-infused sauce a complex symphony of flavors. It wasn't just food. It was a memory of a cozy French bistro, a feeling of warmth he had never known. Another evening, a simple, yet perfect, risotto with mushrooms and Parmesan cheese. Each bite was earthy, creamy, and deeply satisfying, a quiet moment of pure indulgence. Ethan found himself not just eating, but truly savoring each meal. He would sit at the kitchen island long after he was finished, a habit he had never had before, simply enjoying the quiet presence of Clara as she tidied up. He was no longer a ghost in his own home. He was a guest in a story she was creating, a story of comfort, passion, and a kind of richness that had nothing to do with money. The minimalist perfection of his home was softening, slowly but surely, under the influence of her art. He was becoming a man who, for the first time in his life, was not just living but was actually feeling alive. The rhythm of their shared days had settled into a comfortable, unspoken routine. Each afternoon, Clara would arrive, the gentle click of her keys in the lock signaling the start of a new culinary chapter. Ethan, regardless of his schedule, would find a reason to be in or near the kitchen. He would pretend to read a report or answer emails on his laptop, but his attention was always on her. He watched the confident, almost lyrical way her hands moved as she chopped, seasoned, and plated. On this particular day, the air was thick with the rich, comforting scent of sautéed garlic and basil, the base for a classic pomodoro sauce. It was a scent Clara usually adored, one that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen. But today, a strange wave of nausea swept over her. She paused, the wooden spoon clutched in her hand, her vision blurring at the edges. The room began to spin, the vibrant colors of the tomatoes on the counter fading into a grayish haze. She tried to steady herself, leaning against the cold marble countertop, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. The scent, once comforting, now felt overwhelming, cloying. A sudden, intense wave of dizziness hit her, and the spoon slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly on the polished concrete floor. Ethan, who had been watching her from the corner of the living room, was on his feet in an instant. He saw the color drain from her face, the way her eyes fluttered before they closed. He was across the room in a few long strides, catching her just as her knees buckled. Her body was a dead weight in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder. His carefully constructed world of control and order shattered in that moment, replaced by a primal fear he hadn't felt since he was a child. He held her, his heart hammering against his ribs, her quiet form a startling contrast to the sudden, deafening chaos inside him. The silence of the penthouse had been broken, replaced by the sound of his own ragged breath. Ethan's luxury sedan, a vehicle typically reserved for quiet, efficient travel between his office and home, became an ambulance of sorts. He drove through the city's labyrinthine streets with a singular focus, his hand resting on Clara's forehead, which felt clammy and cool. The hospital, a place he usually only knew through charitable donations, was a maze of bustling corridors and stark lighting. He bypassed the usual waiting lines, his name and urgent demeanor clearing a path to an examination room. As Clara lay on the hospital bed, her color slowly returning, a young doctor with a kind face entered the room. After a few preliminary questions and a gentle examination, he turned to Ethan, who stood stiffly by the door, a fortress of worry. "She's fine," the doctor began, "just a little dehydrated and anemic. It's not uncommon in her condition." Clara's head shot up. "My condition?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. The doctor smiled. "Congratulations, you're pregnant." The words hung in the air, a bell tolling in the silence. Ethan's mind reeled. He saw the way Clara's hand, which had been resting on her stomach, instinctively tightened into a protective fist. Her eyes, which had just moments ago held a flicker of returning life, filled with a profound and heartbreaking sadness. The doctor, sensing the tension, gave them a moment alone. When he was gone, Clara didn't look at Ethan. She stared at a spot on the wall, her lips trembling. The quiet strength she usually carried had evaporated, replaced by a devastating vulnerability. This wasn't a moment of joy for her. It was a moment of stark, terrifying reality. Ethan, a man who could solve the most complex business problems, felt utterly helpless. He saw the story in her eyes, not of a happy beginning, but of a woman facing a monumental, life-altering challenge, completely and utterly alone. The silence in the room was no longer just a void. It was a chasm, filled with a truth that would change both of their lives forever. The quiet hum of the hospital room's machines was a stark counterpoint to the turmoil brewing between them. Clara finally broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the sterile white bedspread. "I understand if you want to fire me," she said, the words heavy with a resignation that tore at Ethan. "I should have told you. I was afraid you would." Her confession wasn't just about her job. It was a window into a deeper, more profound fear. She had been living with this secret, carrying the weight of it alone. The man who had fathered the child was long gone, a ghost from a past she was trying to outrun. She had been saving every penny, meticulously planning for a future that now seemed impossibly bleak. The joy she should have felt was buried under a mountain of anxiety and the very real threat of losing her only source of income. Ethan watched her, a knot tightening in his chest. He saw the tremble in her hands, the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. This wasn't the strong, confident chef who commanded his kitchen with an artist's precision. This was a young woman, vulnerable and terrified, facing a world that had just gotten exponentially more complicated. She wasn't just worried about a job. She was worried about her very survival, and the survival of the life growing inside her. Her unspoken fear was a palpable presence in the room, a silent plea for understanding and compassion in a world that had so far offered her little of either. The silence in the hospital room stretched, heavy and tense, as Clara waited for the inevitable. She braced herself for the cold, professional dismissal she was certain would come. She had prepared a practiced, dignified response, a final act of grace before she had to walk out of his life forever. But when Ethan finally spoke, his words were nothing she could have ever prepared for. "I'm not going to fire you, Clara." His voice was calm, steady, and held none of the anger or disappointment she had expected. He stepped away from the door, moving closer to her bed, his demeanor a stark contrast to the boardroom persona the world knew. "My home is a mess of a life I don't know how to live," he said, his gaze fixed on her face. Your food has been the only real thing in it for weeks. It would be a mistake to let you go." Clara's eyes, wide with disbelief, searched his for a hidden motive, a catch, but she found only a strange, unfamiliar sincerity. Then he made a decision that shocked even himself, a leap of faith that was entirely foreign to his calculated existence. "You're not just going to stay," he continued, a new resolve hardening his tone. "You're going to let me take care of you. The doctor said you're anemic and dehydrated. From now on, you're not cooking. I am." The words hung in the air, a statement of intent that was both completely irrational and profoundly human. He wasn't offering her a charity case. He was offering a partnership, a solution to a problem he had inexplicably made his own. Clara was speechless. The man who had everything, a man whose every move was a calculated risk, was now offering to cook for her, a young woman he barely knew, who was carrying another man's child. In that moment, surrounded by the sterile emptiness of the hospital room, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not pity, but a quiet, protective instinct that was more precious than any fortune. It was the moment their world began to shift on its axis. The next morning, the sterile perfection of Ethan's kitchen was broken by the sound of fumbling. Ethan, a man who commanded boardrooms with a single glance, was utterly at a loss in his own kitchen. The pristine counter, usually reserved for Clara's careful preparations, was now a battlefield of his clumsy attempts. He had decided on scrambled eggs, a dish so simple it felt impossible to mess up. He was wrong. He had cracked the eggs directly into a hot pan, forgetting to whisk them first. The result was a clumpy, rubbery mess that sizzled and stuck to the non-stick surface. He tried to flip them with a spatula, but the eggs crumbled into small, sad pieces. A plume of smoke rose from the pan, setting off a quiet, polite alarm that chirped once before he frantically waved a towel at it. Clara, who was sitting at the island, wrapped in a plush robe Ethan had given her, watched the spectacle with a faint, amused smile. She had spent the last 24 hours in a daze, trying to reconcile the cold, professional billionaire with this man who was struggling so desperately to make her breakfast. "You have to whisk them first," she said softly, her voice still a little hoarse from the exhaustion. "In a bowl, and use a little milk or cream." Ethan paused, a look of profound concentration on his face. He nodded, retrieved a bowl, and began again. This time, he cracked the eggs into the bowl, but the force of his hand sent a shard of shell flying in. He sighed, defeated, as he fished it out with his finger. "Like this," Clara said, pushing herself up from the stool. She moved with a gentle slowness, her hand coming to rest over his. For a moment, a jolt of unexpected electricity passed between them. Her fingers were warm and soft. He looked down, watching as she guided his hand, showing him the rhythmic motion of the whisk, the smooth turn of the spatula. The eggs, this time, came out perfect, fluffy, creamy, and golden. He plated them for her, placing the dish in front of her with a quiet triumph. Clara took a bite and smiled. "They're perfect," she whispered. The simple act of a shared, awkward meal had broken the last of their professional barriers. In the midst of his kitchen disaster, a new kind of intimacy had been born. He wasn't just the CEO anymore, and she wasn't just the chef. They were two people sharing a scrambled egg and the beginning of a story he was clumsily, but willingly learning to cook. The next morning, the sterile perfection of Ethan's kitchen was broken by the sound of fumbling. Ethan, a man who commanded boardrooms with a single glance, was utterly at a loss in his own kitchen. The pristine counter, usually reserved for Clara's careful preparations, was now a battlefield of his clumsy attempts. He had decided on scrambled eggs, a dish so simple it felt impossible to mess up. He was wrong. He had cracked the eggs directly into a hot pan, forgetting to whisk them first. The result was a clumpy, rubbery mess that sizzled and stuck to the non-stick surface. He tried to flip them with a spatula, but the eggs crumbled into small, sad pieces. A plume of smoke rose from the pan, setting off a quiet, polite alarm that chirped once before he frantically waved a towel at it. Clara, who was sitting at the island, wrapped in a plush robe Ethan had given her, watched the spectacle with a faint, amused smile. She had spent the last 24 hours in a daze, trying to reconcile the cold, professional billionaire with this man who was struggling so desperately to make her breakfast. "You have to whisk them first," she said softly, her voice still a little hoarse from the exhaustion. "In a bowl. And use a little milk or cream." Ethan paused, a look of profound concentration on his face. He nodded, retrieved a bowl, and began again. This time, he cracked the eggs into the bowl, but the force of his hand sent a shard of shell flying in. He sighed, defeated, as he fished it out with his finger. "Like this," Clara said, pushing herself up from the stool. She moved with a gentle slowness, her hand coming to rest over his. For a moment, a jolt of unexpected electricity passed between them. Her fingers were warm and soft. He looked down, watching as she guided his hand, showing him the rhythmic motion of the whisk, the smooth turn of the spatula. The eggs, this time, came out perfect, fluffy, creamy, and golden. He plated them for her, placing the dish in front of her with a quiet triumph. Clara took a bite and smiled. "They're perfect," she whispered. The simple act of a shared, awkward meal had broken the last of their professional barriers. In the midst of his kitchen disaster, a new kind of intimacy had been born. He wasn't just the CEO anymore, and she wasn't just the chef. They were two people sharing a scrambled egg and the beginning of a story he was clumsily, but willingly learning to cook. The roles had now been completely and utterly reversed. The man who wielded power in boardrooms now wielded a spatula, and the woman who had created culinary masterpieces now sat on the sidelines, an amused and gentle spectator. Ethan's kitchen, once a sterile stage for Clara's art, had become his new learning ground, and he was an eager student. He started with basics, meticulously following Clara's instructions. His first perfect omelet was a moment of quiet triumph. His first loaf of bread, misshapen but delicious, was a source of great pride. He spent hours on his laptop, not for business but for research. He devoured articles on prenatal nutrition, learned the difference between a julienne and a brunoise, and experimented with flavors he had never even considered before. Clara, in her new role as culinary consultant, would offer a quiet word of advice from the kitchen island, a small smile playing on her lips. She would watch as he became engrossed in the process, his forehead furrowed in concentration as he tried to get the seasoning just right. The man who had been the master of his universe now found a profound, simple joy in the act of creation, in the nurturing of another person. The sterile perfection of the penthouse was being slowly, irrevocably changed. It was no longer a monument to his solitude, but a testament to a new, shared existence. The rhythmic sounds of the kitchen, the scent of fresh herbs, and the soft, murmured conversations between them were slowly transforming the cold, minimalist space into a place that felt, for the first time, like a home. Ethan was no longer the CEO who commanded the city. He was simply the man who was learning to cook for the woman he was beginning to care for, one clumsy, heartfelt meal at a time. The kitchen, once a place of professional transaction, had become their sanctuary. The clatter of pans and the soft sizzle of oil were the new soundtrack to their lives, and the conversations that unfolded over the chopping board were the richest Ethan had ever had. Their dialogue had moved far beyond culinary instructions. One evening, as Ethan carefully chopped carrots for a stew, Clara, perched on a stool, spoke about her childhood. She painted a picture of a bustling, loving home filled with the aromas of her grandmother's cooking. She talked about the simple joy of picking fresh herbs from a small garden and the pride she felt in her first lopsided biscuit. She spoke of her dreams, of one day owning a small cafe, a place where people could come for warmth and good food. Ethan listened intently, the steady rhythm of his knife against the cutting board mirroring the quiet beat of his heart. He, in turn, began to open up about his own life. He spoke of the relentless pressure of his world, the loneliness of leadership, and the simple satisfaction he now found in a well-seasoned broth. He told her about his parents, who had died when he was young, leaving him with an inheritance and a profound sense of responsibility he'd carried like a heavy stone ever since. The weight of his solitude, a burden he had never admitted to anyone, felt a little lighter as he shared it with her. He learned about the man who had left her, a fleeting ghost from her past, a mistake she was now determined to turn into her greatest strength. She, in turn, learned about the human behind the headlines, the man who was just as lost as she was. Their shared stories, like the ingredients in his simmering stew, were blending together, creating a rich and complex mixture of empathy, trust, and a connection that was deepening with every passing day. The steam from the pot wasn't just a byproduct of cooking. It was a warm, hazy veil over their shared vulnerabilities, a silent witness to a bond that was quietly, irrevocably forming. For weeks, Clara had observed Ethan's transformation with a quiet wonder. The formidable CEO, the man whose name was a byword for ruthlessness and precision, had been replaced by a man who worried about the perfect ratio of butter to flour and the right temperature for simmering stock. She saw him not in the sterile glow of a boardroom, but in the warm, intimate light of his kitchen. This was a man who, despite his immense wealth, found profound satisfaction in a simple home-cooked meal. One evening, as he plated a rich chicken and vegetable stew, his brow furrowed in concentration, she spoke without thinking. The world sees you as a machine, a force of nature. He paused, a wooden spoon midair. Is that what you see? He asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Clara shook her head, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. I see a man who worries if he's added enough salt, and who gets genuinely excited when a loaf of bread rises perfectly. I see a man who gets up at dawn to make sure I have a good breakfast. The world sees a CEO. I see a man who just wants to take care of someone. Her words hung in the air, a profound confession that bridged the vast chasm between their lives. He looked at her, his usual mask of stoicism cracking to reveal a flash of vulnerability, of gratitude. He hadn't realized how much he needed to be seen, not for the empire he had built, but for the man he was becoming. In that moment, she had given him a gift more precious than any business deal or stock portfolio. She had given him the gift of being seen. And in doing so, she had peeled back a layer of her own self-preservation, revealing a woman who was no longer just the chef, but a confidant. The kitchen, usually a place of quiet conversation and focused work, was filled with a gentle, expectant stillness. The evening had drawn in, painting the cityscape outside in hues of deep violet and gold. Ethan had just finished a simple but nourishing lentil soup, a dish he had perfected over the past week for Clara. As he placed a steaming bowl in front of her, she rested a hand on her swollen belly, a small, weary sigh escaping her lips. He's been so quiet today, she whispered, her voice tinged with a worry she couldn't hide. Sometimes I worry. Ethan's heart gave a strange lurch. He moved to sit beside her, his hand hovering awkwardly in the air before he, without thinking, placed it gently on her stomach, right next to hers. He was a man of steel and logic, a stranger to this world of life and softness. But in this moment, his hand felt a warmth that was foreign yet comforting. As he sat there, feeling the quiet life beneath his palm, he waited. And then it happened. A tiny, fluttering tremor. A subtle but unmistakable nudge. It was a sensation so profound, so utterly real, that it took his breath away. The kick wasn't just a physical movement. It was a silent greeting, a connection to a life he was helping to nurture. Clara's face lit up with a brilliant, tearful smile. He kicks when you cook, she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I think he likes your food. The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't about the food anymore. It wasn't about the task, the chore, or the kindness. It was about a bond, a family forming in the quiet intimacy of a kitchen. He wasn't just a man cooking for a pregnant woman. He was a man connected to the life inside her. In that single, breathtaking moment, he understood what he was truly falling for, and the magnitude of it all, the love, the fear, and the profound, life-altering joy, hit him with an overwhelming certainty. The simple act of his hand on her belly, feeling the tiny flutter of a new life, had shattered Ethan's carefully constructed world. In that moment, surrounded by the warm, homey scent of his lentil soup, he realized the truth that had been building inside him for weeks. He was falling in love. The feeling was a complete and utter contradiction to everything he believed about himself. He was a man of logic, of calculated risks and predictable outcomes. Love, in his world, was an abstract concept, an emotion reserved for the kind of people who had time for it. Yet, here he was, staring at a woman who was carrying another man's child, and his heart was hammering with a fierce, protective longing. He saw the way the city lights twinkled outside his window, the same lights that had once represented his dominion, but now they seemed distant and insignificant. The real world was here, in this quiet kitchen with Clara. It wasn't just her he was falling for, but the idea of them, the quiet, shared life they were building. The thought was terrifying. It was a risk far greater than any business venture, a vulnerability he had spent his entire life avoiding. But the alternative, a life without them, a return to the sterile silence of his gilded cage, was a far greater fear. He looked at Clara, her face soft in the low light, her hands still resting on her belly. He wanted to protect her, to provide for her, to be a part of the life she was creating. He wanted to be the man who made her soup, the man who felt the first kick of her child. He wasn't the same man who had hired a chef for convenience. He was a man who had found his purpose in the warmth of a kitchen, and he was falling irrevocably and completely for the woman who had helped him find it. While Ethan's world was shrinking to the intimate, quiet universe of his penthouse kitchen, the world he had built, the world of sterling innovations, was taking notice of his absence. Marcus Thorne, his business partner and a man as sharp and unforgiving as a scalpel, grew increasingly agitated. For years, Ethan's focus had been a laser beam aimed at the company's growth, his decisions swift and ruthless. Now he seemed distracted, detached. His emails were less frequent, his presence in crucial meetings was a ghost of its former self, and he had even, unbelievably, rescheduled a major merger negotiation because of a personal matter. Marcus's keen business sense told him something was wrong. This wasn't the Ethan he knew, the one who sacrificed sleep for a favorable market position and lived on a diet of black coffee and ambition. He saw the subtle but significant changes. Ethan's phone calls were shorter, his voice softer. He spoke less about quarterly reports and more about an inexplicable need for work-life balance, a phrase that, to Marcus, sounded like a terminal illness. The rumors started to trickle down from the executive floor. Whispers of a new woman, of a newfound interest in domesticity. Marcus dismissed them as nonsense, but the suspicion gnawed at him. The stability of their company, a multi-billion-dollar empire, rested on Ethan's shoulders. Marcus felt a primal fear that the foundation of their success was being compromised by some foolish, sentimental distraction. He knew he had to act. The next morning, he would find out exactly what was happening behind the glass walls of Ethan's penthouse, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to protect their empire. The silent, peaceful bubble Ethan had created was about to collide with the ruthless reality of the world he had once commanded. Ethan's world was no longer a seamless flow of data and decisions. It was a constant, jarring clash between two realities. In the mornings, he would spend an hour in his kitchen, preparing a nutrient-rich breakfast for Clara, carefully selecting each ingredient as if it were a high-stakes market asset. He would feel a quiet satisfaction as she ate, the simple act of care more rewarding than any successful IPO. But the moment he walked out the door and into the waiting town car, the quiet intimacy of his home was replaced by the harsh, unrelenting pressures of his empire. The whispers in the boardroom were growing louder. A crucial merger with a competing tech firm, a deal that could secure Sterling Innovations' dominance for the next decade, was at a standstill. The other CEO was known to be notoriously difficult, and Ethan's unusual lack of focus was beginning to show. He would sit in meetings, his mind wandering to Clara's next doctor's appointment or whether she had remembered to take her prenatal vitamins. He found himself sketching floor plans for a nursery on his notepad during a presentation about financial projections. The weight of this duality was crushing. He was a man with one foot in a new, uncharted world of love and family, and the other in the familiar, but now suffocating world of power and profit. He knew he was at a crossroads. He could no longer be both men. The ruthless, solitary CEO was incompatible with the caring, hopeful man who made lentil soup for a pregnant woman. The time was coming when he would have to choose, and the choice would either secure his legacy or, in the eyes of the world, destroy it. The empire he had built was demanding a sacrifice, and for the first time in his life, Ethan was not sure he was willing to pay the price. Clara, despite her quiet nature, was not oblivious. She saw the lines of stress deepening around Ethan's eyes, the way he would often stare into the middle distance. His brow furrowed in a thought that had nothing to do with her or the baby. The man who had found such a simple joy in the act of cooking for her was now a man divided. She knew it had to do with his work, with the world he had, for a time, completely shut out. The weight of their secret began to feel heavy on her heart. She was a simple girl from a small town, and she had inadvertently become a disruptive force in a billionaire's life. He had given her so much: a safe home, a sense of purpose, and a kindness she hadn't thought existed in the world. She saw his love for her and the baby not just in the perfect omelets he made, but in the way his hand would instinctively go to her back when she stood up, or the way his eyes would light up when he felt a kick. A profound guilt began to creep in. She was a distraction, a complication in a life that was built on precision and control. She worried that she was jeopardizing his empire, the very foundation of his identity. One evening, as he sat across from her, a half-eaten meal in front of him, she finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan looked up, startled. "For what?" "For all of this," she said, gesturing vaguely around the room. "For being a distraction. For getting in the way of your real life." The words pained him, a sharp reminder of the chasm that still existed between them. He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch firm and reassuring. "This," he said, his voice low and earnest, "this is my real life. Everything else, that's just business." But the conviction in his voice couldn't completely erase the worry in her heart. She knew that in his world, business was a force of nature, and she was terrified of what would happen when it inevitably came to claim him back. The fragile peace of the penthouse was shattered by a jarring, insistent ring of the doorbell. It was a sound Ethan rarely heard, as his life was meticulously shielded from such intrusions. He glanced at Clara, who was on the sofa, a book resting on her stomach. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before he composed himself. He opened the door to find Marcus Thorne, his face a tight mask of barely contained fury. Marcus, a man who saw the world in black and white, took in the scene behind Ethan. The soft glow of the lamps, the faint smell of roasted garlic, and the unmistakable, comfortable domesticity. His gaze fell upon Clara on the sofa, and a cold, hard suspicion solidified into a grim certainty. "Ethan," Marcus began, his voice low and dangerous. "We need to talk." Ethan stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door almost shut behind him. "Marcus, this is not a good time." "It's about the merger," Marcus said, his eyes drilling into Ethan's. "They're about to walk. You've been distracted, unfocused. I've covered for you for weeks, but I can't anymore. What is happening to you?" "I'm fine," Ethan said, his voice clipped. "I'll handle it." But Marcus wasn't listening. He pushed past Ethan, his eyes scanning the living room, taking in the evidence of a life Ethan had built in secret. He saw Clara, her hand unconsciously resting on her belly, a sight that confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't a fling. It was a serious, life-altering complication. "I see," Marcus said, his tone dripping with contempt. "A woman. Family. You're throwing away everything we built for this? He gestured around the room, his contemptuous gaze lingering on Clara. This is a liability, Ethan. This is a weakness. You're compromising the company, and I won't let you. The words were a direct assault on the life Ethan had been so carefully building, a life he was now forced to defend. The two worlds had finally collided, and there was no turning back. The air in the penthouse was thick with a tension that felt heavier than the silence had ever been. Marcus's words, laced with contempt, hung in the air, a venomous indictment of the life Ethan had been building. Clara, sensing the animosity, had risen from the sofa, a hand instinctively going to her belly as if to shield it from the ugliness of the moment. Ethan's face, usually a mask of calm composure, was a storm of barely suppressed fury. The man who had navigated 1,000 high-stakes negotiations felt a primal, protective rage he had never known. This wasn't about a merger or a market share. It was about the two people he had come to love more than his empire. "Get out," Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous, a sound Marcus had never heard before. Marcus scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Ethan, be reasonable. This is about a multi-billion-dollar company. This woman is a liability. You're letting sentiment get in the way of everything we built." "You don't understand," Ethan retorted, his voice rising. "This is not a business deal. This is my life. Clara and the baby, they are not a liability. They are the only real thing I've ever had." He moved to stand in front of Clara, a protective barrier between her and the cold, unyielding world Marcus represented. It was a clear line in the sand, a stark choice made without a moment's hesitation. The old Ethan, the CEO who would have sacrificed anything for the company, was gone. In his place was a man who would sacrifice everything for his new family. "The merger is off," Ethan declared, his voice ringing with finality. "I'll deal with the fallout. You can tell them that Sterling Innovations is no longer for sale. You can tell them that my priorities have changed. I am no longer a force for profit. I am a force for my family." Marcus stood stunned, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. He looked from Ethan's determined face to Clara's tear-filled eyes, and for the first time, he saw a crack in the facade of the man he thought he knew. Ethan, the man who had owned the city, was now willing to give it all up for a quiet life in a warm kitchen. With a final, disgusted look, Marcus turned and left, the slam of the front door echoing like a final farewell to Ethan's old life. The silence that followed Marcus's departure was profound, but this time, it wasn't empty. It was filled with the lingering echo of Ethan's words, a declaration that had changed everything. He stood in the middle of the room, his shoulders still squared for a fight that was now over, his gaze fixed on Clara. She was still standing, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. He walked to her slowly, the distance between them feeling like a chasm he had to cross. He took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "I meant what I said," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "This is my real life." Clara's lip trembled. You gave up the merger. For me. For us." He nodded, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "The merger. It was just business. It was a deal. It's not a life. You are my life. And the baby," he added, his voice thick with a love he was only just learning to name. "You've both shown me what it means to be truly rich. Not in money, but in purpose, in feeling. I was a ghost in my own home, in my own life. You brought me back." The city lights outside the window twinkled like a million distant stars, but Ethan only saw her. He saw the kindness in her eyes, the quiet strength that had endured so much, and the love that was now shining through her tears. He had built an empire on logic and calculated risks, but in this moment, he was operating on pure, unadulterated emotion. "I love you, Clara," he confessed, the words a physical weight on his tongue, a truth he had carried in his heart for weeks. "I love you more than any building I've ever owned or any company I've ever built. I love the life we're building, and I love the person you've helped me become." The words were a leap of faith, a final surrender of his old self to this new, terrifying, and beautiful life. He waited, his heart pounding in his chest, for her reply. The silence was no longer a chasm but a fragile, sacred space filled with the weight of Ethan's confession. Clara's mind reeled, replaying his words, each one a stark, beautiful contrast to the life she had been preparing for. She had expected to face the world alone, to raise her child in quiet struggle. Instead, she was standing in a billionaire's penthouse, listening to him confess his love and sacrifice his empire for her and the life growing inside her. Tears, no longer of sorrow but of profound relief and overwhelming joy, welled in her eyes. Her voice, when it came, was a soft, trembling whisper that was nonetheless full of an unwavering certainty. "I love you too, Ethan." The words were her final surrender, the crumbling of the last wall she had built around her heart. She had fallen for him slowly, quietly, in the moments when she watched him struggle with a spatula, in the way he would read a prenatal health book with the same intensity he once read a market report. She had fallen for the man who worried about her comfort, the man who found purpose not in billions of dollars but in the warmth of a kitchen. He stepped closer, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "I never thought I could feel this way," he murmured, his gaze filled with an emotion she had only ever dreamed of. "I was a machine running on data and ambition. You taught me how to be human." She reached up, her hands cupping his face, her touch a soft caress that felt like a promise. "And you," she whispered, "you showed me that there is a kindness in the world. You taught me to hope again. For our baby, for our family, for us." He leaned in, and as the city lights twinkled in the background, they shared their first kiss. It wasn't a passionate, breathless moment from a movie, but a soft, tender meeting of two people who had found each other against all odds. It was the kiss of a promise, a quiet vow to build a future together, to face the world as a family, and to find their home in each other's arms. The days that followed were a quiet testament to their new beginning. With Marcus gone and the merger officially dead, Ethan felt a sense of freedom he hadn't known since he was a boy. The immense pressure he had carried for 2 decades had been lifted, replaced by the simple, profound purpose of building a life with Clara. They began to plan their future with a quiet joy. The penthouse, once a stark and impersonal space, was now a canvas for their shared vision. They spent evenings sketching out ideas for a nursery, laughing as they debated between a nautical theme and a safari one. They ordered baby furniture, their conversations filled with the mundane, yet magical, details of parenthood. The delivery trucks that pulled up to the front of the building were no longer bringing in art pieces or business documents. They were bringing cribs and rocking chairs. Ethan had completely handed over the day-to-day operations of Sterling Innovations to a trusted team, stepping back to take on a new, more important role. He spent his mornings with Clara, making her breakfast and helping her with her prenatal exercises. In the afternoons, they would take long, slow walks in Central Park, their hands intertwined, talking about everything and nothing. He found himself looking at the city with new eyes, no longer as a titan who owned it, but as a man who was simply a part of it, a man who was happy to be on solid ground with the woman he loved. Their love story wasn't a sudden explosion of passion, but a slow, methodical construction. It was built on the foundation of shared vulnerability, quiet acts of care, and the simple, unwavering certainty that they were meant to be a family. The world outside could talk all it wanted, but inside the penthouse, a new life was being built, brick by emotional brick, and it was the most magnificent thing Ethan had ever created. The quiet sanctuary of their love was a secret too good to last in a city ruled by headlines. It started with a whisper, a leak from a disgruntled employee, a photo taken by a paparazzi lurking outside Ethan's building. The initial trickle of rumors soon became a flood. The New York business press, which had long celebrated Ethan Sterling as a modern-day king of Wall Street, now dissected his every move with a venomous curiosity. Headlines screamed of a billionaire's betrayal, his reckless abandonment of a multi-billion-dollar merger for a mysterious young chef. Pundits on cable news debated his mental fitness, suggesting he was either being blackmailed or had suffered a complete breakdown. They called his love for Clara a midlife crisis, a sentimental folly that could jeopardize the financial stability of his company. For Ethan, the attacks were a vicious but expected part of his world. He was a seasoned veteran of public scrutiny and knew how to deflect and ignore the noise. But the public's cruelty was not aimed at him. It was aimed at Clara. Tabloids published grainy pictures of her, fabricating stories about her past and questioning her motives. They portrayed her not as a woman he loved, but as a cunning gold digger who had trapped a vulnerable billionaire with an unplanned pregnancy. Clara, who had always lived a quiet life, was terrified. The paparazzi became a constant presence outside the penthouse, their flashes a blinding, intrusive invasion of her home. The peaceful walks in the park stopped. The easy joy of their new life was overshadowed by a constant, gnawing anxiety. The media was not just a distant storm anymore. It was a force of nature battering at the windows of their home, threatening to destroy the beautiful, fragile thing they had built. Ethan, for the first time, felt a fear far deeper than any business loss. He feared for her safety, for her peace of mind, and for the tiny, innocent life they were so desperately trying to protect. He knew he had to shield her from the storm, no matter the cost to his reputation or his empire. The storm outside, a relentless barrage of headlines and paparazzi flashes, only served to strengthen the walls of their sanctuary. Ethan had hired a team of lawyers to issue cease and desist letters and a new security detail to protect their home. But he knew the only real antidote to the world's noise was a quiet, unwavering commitment. One rainy Saturday morning, as the city outside was veiled in a soft gray mist, Ethan woke Clara with a gentle kiss. He had arranged everything. There would be no grand wedding, no press releases, and no celebrity guests. Instead, there would be a small, private ceremony in the penthouse's living room, which had been transformed into an intimate space adorned with white roses and soft candlelight. Their witnesses were Ethan's long-trusted lawyer, a woman who had been more of a mentor and friend than an employee, and Clara's best friend, who had flown in from her small town, her eyes filled with a mixture of tears and joy. Clara, radiant in a simple, flowing white dress that accentuated her beautiful belly, met Ethan at the small altar. He stood there in a dark suit, his gaze completely and utterly for her. The man who had been a titan of industry was now simply a groom, his hand trembling slightly as he held hers. The officiant, a kind-faced judge, spoke of love not as a fleeting emotion but as a partnership, a quiet promise to face the world together, no matter what it threw their way. Ethan and Clara exchanged their vows, their words soft but firm, a clear declaration of their love and their new life as a family. As they kissed, the rain outside seemed to slow, the city a distant, silent witness to the most important business deal Ethan Sterling had ever closed. A contract of love, signed and sealed with a simple gold band. They were no longer two people. They were a family, forged in the quiet intimacy of their home, ready to face the world together. The months that followed their quiet wedding were a period of waiting, of quiet anticipation that felt far more meaningful than any market forecast. The penthouse, once a symbol of loneliness, was now a vibrant, living space. The minimalist furniture had been pushed aside to make room for a crib and a changing table. The once silent rooms were now filled with the soft melodies of a lullaby or the low murmur of Ethan and Clara's voices as they read parenting books together. Ethan had fully embraced his new role. He still managed his company from a distance, but his mornings were no longer ruled by board meetings but by a more important schedule. Clara's doctor's appointments, her cravings for strange combinations of food, and the simple joy of feeling their baby's movements under his hand. The day their baby was born was the most momentous day of his life, a moment that eclipsed every deal he had ever closed and every company he had ever founded. The final scene of their story unfolds in the quiet chaos of their home. A soft, buttery light fills the living room as the sun sets over the city. Ethan, in a worn t-shirt and jeans, is on the floor, gently rocking a cradle with his foot. He is watching Clara, who is fast asleep on the sofa, her face peaceful and beautiful in the evening light, their newborn son nestled against her chest. The baby, a tiny, perfect creature, gives a soft sigh in his sleep, and the sound is the most beautiful music Ethan has ever heard. He looks around the room, at the clutter of baby toys, the half-read book on the coffee table, the blankets draped over the sofa. This was his life now. It was messy, unpredictable, and infinitely more fulfilling than the one he had meticulously crafted for himself. He had built an empire from nothing, but this messy, joyful, and complicated family was his true masterpiece. In the gentle glow of the setting sun, holding his child, Ethan Sterling finally understood what it meant to be truly rich.